The moment Ella Rhodes stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, her trunk split open on the dusty Main Street, and every last one of her belongings scattered across the road like confetti at a celebration nobody had asked for. She stood there in the golden afternoon light, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, staring at her petticoats and her mother's Bible and her single spare dress lying in the dirt while horses clomped past, and a group of cowboys leaning against the saloon porch laughed themselves half to death. She did not cry. Ella Rhodes had not cried since the night her father's farm in Missouri burned to the ground 2 years ago, and she was not about to start now, not in front of strangers, not in this unfamiliar town that smelled of cattle and horse sweat and something faintly like possibility. She knelt down and began gathering her things with quick, determined hands. "Those yours, ma'am?" The voice came from above her, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned to be patient the way a river learns to go around a rock. She looked up and shielded her eyes against the sun. A tall man stood at the edge of the boardwalk, his hat tipped back on his head, a rifle slung loose across his shoulders the way some men carry a yoke. He had dark eyes set beneath a serious brow, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone that lined the riverbanks outside of town. He was maybe 28, perhaps 30, lean and broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than vanity. He was already bending down to pick up her mother's Bible before she could answer him. He handed it to her carefully, spine up, like he understood what it was. "Thank you," she said, and took it from him. "John Vaughn," he said. He did not offer his hand because both of hers were full, but he said his name like it was a courtesy all on its own. "Ella Rhodes," she said. He nodded once, then without being asked he gathered up the rest of her scattered clothes and set them in a neat pile beside the broken trunk. He studied the busted latch for a moment, then picked the whole thing up under one arm. "There's a carpenter 2 streets over. He'll fix that for a quarter." "I appreciate that," she said. "You meeting someone here?" He asked. There was no prying in it. It was the kind of question people asked each other in towns like this because a woman arriving alone with a broken trunk was either brave or desperate, and sometimes both. "I have a position," she said. "School teacher. The town council wrote to me in February." Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't quite read what it was. "Mrs. Hartley's the one you'll want to see," he said. "She's on the council. Her house is the green one at the end of Maple Street." He paused. "I'll carry this for you." "You don't have to do that," Ella said. "I know I don't," he said simply, and started walking. She followed him because there was nothing else logical to do, and also because something about John Vaughn made a person want to walk in the same direction he was headed. Caldwell in the spring of 1878 was a cattle town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be when it grew up. The Kishom Trail ran right through it, which meant money and trouble arrived together and left together, and the town had grown up fast and a little sideways as a result. There were good people here. Ella would come to learn, solid people who built churches and planted kitchen gardens, and argued passionately at town meetings about whether or not to widen Main Street. But there were also men who came up from Texas with the cattle herds, men who had been riding hard for weeks and wanted to spend their wages on whiskey and cards and fights that ended with somebody's nose on a different part of their face than it had started. The Marshal's office was busy most nights. The church was busy Sunday mornings. Everything in between was negotiable. Mrs. Hartley was a stout woman of 50 with silver hair and a no-nonsense manner that Ella immediately liked. She showed Ella the small room above the general store that the town had arranged as her living quarters, and explained the terms of her position with the brisk efficiency of someone who had written the terms herself. The schoolhouse was a single-room building on the north end of town. 22 children were enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 14. School would begin on Monday morning. "Do you have any questions, Miss Rhodes?" Mrs. Hartley asked. "Only one," Ella said. "Who was the teacher before me?" Mrs. Hartley's expression flickered. "That would be Miss Prewitt," she said. "She left in January, she and Mr." Caldwell's eldest son had an understanding and she followed him to Wichita. Ella nodded. She understood perfectly. Women in the West did what the circumstances of their hearts required of them. She spent her first weekend in Caldwell unpacking her repaired trunk, hanging her dresses on the 2 hooks behind the door, and arranging her books on the windowsill. She had 11 books, which she considered a small fortune. She had her McGuffey readers and her geography text and her arithmetic primer, and a collection of Shakespeare that a kind professor at the girls' school in Missouri had pressed into her hands when she was 16, and told her would serve her better than anything else he could give her. She had her mother's Bible, which she set on the small bedside table where she could reach it in the night. She did not let herself think too much about Missouri. About the farm and the fire, and her father's shoulders bent like a question mark over what remained of everything they had built. He had sent her west not because he did not love her, but because he did. There was nothing left for her in Missouri, and he had said so with the terrible honesty of a man who had run out of ways to sugarcoat the truth. She thought instead about the children she would teach on Monday, and she thought, briefly, and without meaning to, about a man with dark eyes who had picked up her mother's Bible from the dirt of Main Street without being asked. She did not see John Vaughn again until Wednesday. She was walking back from the schoolhouse in the early evening, her lesson books tucked under her arm, when she passed the livery stable and heard a low, steady voice coming from inside. She paused without quite meaning to. Through the open door she could see John Vaughn standing with a young horse, a bay mare that was clearly frightened of something, her eyes wide and her front feet dancing. He was not pulling at her or forcing her. He was just standing close and talking. Ella could not hear the words from where she stood, only the tone of them, unhurried and even and calm, and she watched the mare's ears swivel toward him, watched the animals breathing slow as if the voice itself were medicine. He must have sensed her in the doorway because he glanced up, and she felt her face warm the way it did when she was caught doing something she had not planned to do. "Miss Rhodes," he said. He did not seem surprised. He seemed, if anything, slightly pleased, though it was a reserved kind of pleasure, the kind that a man who has taught himself to be careful with his feelings lets out only a little at a time. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said. "You're not interrupting anything. She's just scared of the wind today. Come in if you like." She stepped into the dim warmth of the livery and stood a few feet from the mare. The horse regarded her with enormous amber eyes. "She's beautiful," Ella said. "She is," John agreed. "Her name is Juniper. She came in with the herd out of Texas last month. Her owner didn't make it past Abilene." There was no drama in the way he said it, just the simple fact of it. The West was full of those kinds of facts. Men who didn't make it past Abilene. Women who had followed men to Wichita and been heard from less and less after that. "Are you the Marshal?" she asked, because of the rifle she'd seen the first day and because of the way he moved through the town with a kind of quiet authority. "Deputy," he said. "Marshal Greer runs the office. I just help keep things quiet." "Is that difficult, keeping things quiet?" He looked at her with something that might have been amusement, though it was buried deep. "Some nights more than others," he said. "How's the schoolhouse?" "Wonderful," she said, and she meant it. "2 children, and every single one of them is curious about something different. That's the best kind of classroom." He nodded, stroking the mare's neck in long, easy strokes. "What were you curious about at that age?" The question surprised her. Men did not usually ask her what she had been curious about. They asked whether she could cook and whether she intended to stay in Caldwell long and whether she had family somewhere who might come to visit. "Everything," she said honestly. "The sky mostly. I used to lie on the roof of our farmhouse in Missouri and watch the stars come out and try to name them all." She paused. "I was also very curious about why people did the things they did. Why some people were kind and some weren't when they'd all been born the same way." John was quiet for a moment. Juniper had dropped her head and was breathing normally now, her lower lip loose and relaxed. "Did you ever figure that one out?" he asked. "Not entirely," Ella admitted, "but I'm still working on it." He looked at her then, a steady, direct look that she met without flinching. Something passed between them in that moment that neither of them could have named exactly. Something like recognition, the peculiar sensation of meeting a person and understanding, beneath all logic and reason, that you are going to know them for the rest of your life. "I'll walk you back to your rooms," he said. "It's getting dark." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't," he said again, and she found herself smiling this time. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Ella had not expected to find so quickly. She taught her classes from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, moving between long division and geography and the reading of passages from the McGuffey readers with a confidence that surprised even herself. The children were wonderful and terrible in equal measure, the way children always are, full of energy and distraction and sudden moments of startling insight. There was a boy named Tommy Greer, the Marshal's son, who was 10 years old and could not sit still for more than 4 minutes at a time, but who could multiply 3-digit numbers in his head faster than Ella could write them on the board. There was a girl named Ruth Haskell who was 12, and who had read more books than half the adults in town, and who sometimes looked at Ella with a serious, measuring gaze that made Ella feel like the student. In the evenings, Ella would sit at her small desk and prepare her lessons for the next day, and sometimes she would hear John Vaughn's boots on the boardwalk outside as he made his evening rounds, and sometimes she would go to the window and watch him move through the lantern-lit street below, easy and unhurried, and she would feel something stir in her chest that she did not immediately know how to categorize. He began to find reasons to be in her vicinity. Not in a way that was obvious or clumsy. He was not a clumsy man in any sense, but in a way that revealed itself gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. He would be at the general store when she came to buy her weekly provisions. He would be at the church steps on Sunday when she came out after the service. He began tipping his hat when they passed each other on the street, which he had done from the beginning, but there was something different in it now. Something more personal, as if the hat tipping were a small private language that belonged only to the two of them. One afternoon in late April, he showed up at the schoolhouse door just as she was releasing the children for the day. He waited on the steps while the children filed past him, several of the boys calling him Deputy Vaughn with enormous reverence. When the last of them had gone, he came to the open door and leaned against the frame with his arms crossed. "I thought you might want to see something," he said. "What is it?" she asked. "You'll have to come and see." She put her lesson books in her desk and locked the schoolhouse and walked with him through the town and out the north end where the houses thinned, and the prairie spread itself wide and golden in every direction. He led her up a low rise of ground that she had not noticed before. Not quite a hill, but enough of an elevation to give a person the impression of standing above the world. And from the top of it, she could see the town below, and the long silver thread of the creek to the east, and the darkening dome of sky above. And on the far western horizon, the sun was going down in colors she had never seen before, orange and rose, and a deep saturated purple that made her breath catch. "I thought you might like it," he said, "on account of the sky." She turned to look at him. He was watching the sunset with the same expression he had worn in the livery with Juniper, patient and present and quietly attentive. "How did you know about this place?" she asked. "I came out here the first week I arrived in Caldwell," he said. 3 years ago, I needed to think and I didn't know anyone and I just walked until I was somewhere high enough to see everything at once." He paused. "It helped." "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Virginia originally, then Tennessee, then a year in Abilene." He was quiet for a moment. "I was in the war, the tail end of it. I was 15 when it ended. By the time I was old enough to make my own choices, the East didn't have much left in it for me, so I came West." There it was again, she thought, that particular quality of the West, the way it was made up of people who had come from somewhere else, who had arrived carrying the weight of things left behind, wars and fires and losses and the particular sorrow of places that had ceased to be what they once were. "My father fought too," she said. "He came home different." "They all did," John said. He said it without bitterness, just with the flat, factual weight of something that was simply true. They stood together watching the last of the color drain out of the sky and the stars begin to emerge one by one, and Ella felt the strange and wonderful sensation of standing next to someone who took up exactly the right amount of space in the world, not too much and not too little, someone whose silence was as comfortable as conversation. "I know the names of most of them," she said, looking up. He looked up too. "The stars. I used to lie on the roof of our farmhouse and name them," she said. "Show me," he said. She lifted her arm and pointed. "That bright one there is Venus. It's a planet, not a star, but it looks like a star. And that cluster is the Pleiades, the seven sisters. And that long bright line is Orion's belt, though it's fading this time of year." She moved her hand across the sky. "And that one, the very bright one in the north, that's Polaris, the North Star. That's how you know which way is north even when you can't see anything else." He was watching her hand as she pointed, and then he was watching her face, and she knew it without looking at him, felt it the way you feel the warmth of a fire when you turn your back to it. "Ella," he said. She turned. He was close enough that she could see the individual shadows cast by his features in the fading light. He looked like he was thinking something through with great seriousness, weighing it the way a man weighs a decision he knows he cannot take back. "I would like to walk with you on Sunday afternoons," he said, "if you're willing." It was perhaps the most formal, earnest, old-fashioned way a person could have said what he was saying, and she loved him a little for it. "I would like that," she said. He nodded once as if the matter were now settled, and they walked back to town together in the gathering dark. They walked every Sunday afternoon after that, and the walks grew longer as the spring warmed into summer. They walked along the creek bank and through the tall grass of the prairie, and sometimes out to the rise where they had first watched the stars come out. They talked about everything and nothing, about her students and his work, and the books she was reading and the horses he was training, because it turned out that gentling frightened horses was a thing John Vaughn did with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything else in his life. They talked about Missouri and Virginia, and the peculiar way the West made people feel simultaneously free and lost. They talked about the future in careful, circling ways, not yet saying exactly what they meant but orbiting the subject with increasing closeness. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn a landscape by walking it rather than viewing it from above. He had a younger sister in Tennessee named Clara who wrote to him twice a year. He had been a good student before the war interrupted his schooling and had taught himself to read more widely after, history and natural science, and whatever he could find. He was 29 years old. He drank moderately and never gambled and had a temper that he had worked hard to bring under control, which she could see in the occasional tightening of his jaw when something frustrated him, and in the deliberate breath he took before speaking. She told him things too, things she had not told anyone in Caldwell, about the fire and the farm and her father's defeat. About her mother, who had died of fever when Ella was 11, and who had taught her to love books and stars and the particular beauty of things that were honest. About the loneliness of the years since, which had been real and had sometimes been very hard, but which had also made her into someone she was not ashamed of being. "You're not lonely now," he said one evening in June, and it was not a question. "No," she said, "not now." In July there was trouble. A man named Decker arrived with the tail end of a Texas cattle drive, a big loud man with money in his pocket and a bad habit of deciding that what other people had was rightfully his. He had been causing trouble since his first night in Caldwell, a fight at the saloon, a dispute with a merchant over the price of whiskey, and finally and most seriously, an incident at the livery where he had taken Juniper out for a ride without asking, and returned her with a cut on her flank that made John's jaw go tight in the way Ella had learned to read. Marshal Greer had spoken to Decker. Decker had laughed. It was on a Tuesday evening that things came to a head. Ella was walking back from the schoolhouse later than usual because she had stayed to help Tommy Greer with his reading, which was the one subject that did not come easily to him, and as she came around the corner of the general store, she nearly walked straight into Decker, who was leaning against the wall with 3 of his men, all of them carrying the particular energy of men who have been drinking since noon. "Well now," Decker said, looking her over in a way that made her skin crawl. "Who's this pretty thing?" "I am the school teacher," Ella said crisply and attempted to walk past him. He stepped into her path. "Don't be in such a hurry," he said. "Step aside, please," she said. "Please," he repeated, grinning at his men. "That's real nice manners. That's enough." John Vaughn's voice came from behind Decker, and every man in the group turned. He had come from nowhere or from everywhere. From the way he moved through this town, he had made his responsibility. He was not reaching for his gun, which was somehow more intimidating than if he had been. He was just standing there with his full attention fixed on Decker, and there was something in his face that was very clear and very direct about exactly what would happen if this continued. Decker was a large man, but he was also, underneath the bluster, a man who understood the difference between a person who was pretending to be dangerous and a person who was the real thing. He stepped back. "Just being friendly," he said. "You're done being friendly for tonight," John said. "Go back to the saloon." Decker looked at him for a long moment, then at Ella, then back at John. Whatever he saw in John's face was enough. He turned and walked away, his men filing after him. John waited until they were gone, then turned to Ella. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. And then, because the evening had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, and because he was standing right there looking at her with those dark, serious eyes, she said, "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know I don't," she said, and watched something warm move across his face. Decker and his outfit left Caldwell 2 days later with the rest of the cattle drive, headed north toward the stockyards, and the town settled back into its ordinary rhythms. But the incident had shifted something between Ella and John, had made visible a thing that had been building quietly for months, the way a storm declares itself finally on the horizon after a long week of heavy air. It was John who said it first, on a Sunday afternoon in late July when the heat lay heavy over the prairie, and the creek was low and slow and gold-colored in the afternoon light. They had been sitting on the bank in a companionable silence that had stretched for perhaps 20 minutes, which was the kind of silence that only exists between people who are entirely comfortable with each other. "I don't want to walk with you on Sunday afternoons," he said. She looked at him. "I want to walk with you every day," he said. "I want to be the person you tell things to. I want to be the reason you're not lonely." He paused, and she could see what it cost him to say it, this man who had spent years learning to be careful with himself. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I don't have much practice." "Neither do I," she said. "But I'm serious about it," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever comes from this, I'm serious." She looked at him for a long time, at the honest open line of his face in the afternoon light, at the hands that had picked up her mother's Bible from the dirt the first day she arrived, at the steadiness that ran through him like a vein of something solid and true. "I know you are," she said. "I am too." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched, and it was simple and unhurried and felt like a thing that had always been true. The summer moved through its blazing weeks, and Ella and John became, in the way of frontier towns where everyone knew everyone else's business, a recognized pair. Mrs. Hartley approved with visible satisfaction. Marshal Greer, who was a man of few words even by Western standards, clapped John on the shoulder one morning and said, "Good woman," which from him was essentially an oration. The children at the schoolhouse, who noticed everything, began including John Vaughn in their drawings of families, which Ella found in the margins of their lesson books and which she pressed between the pages of her Shakespeare so she would not lose them. On an evening in August, John took her to dinner at the hotel dining room, which was the finest establishment in Caldwell, which is to say the only establishment in Caldwell where the tablecloths were clean, and the food arrived on plates rather than directly on the table. He wore a jacket she had not seen before, and he had combed his hair, and she wore her green dress, the better of her two, and had done her hair up properly, And when they sat across from each other in the warm lamplight of the dining room, he looked at her across the table with an expression that made her heart turn over in her chest. "You're beautiful," he said, as if this were simply an observation he was making, a fact as neutral and true as the position of the stars. "You're not so bad yourself," she said, and made him laugh, which was one of the things she loved most about him, the laugh that came rarely but when it came was entirely real. They had roast beef and potatoes and apple pie, and they talked and talked the way people talk when they have found the person they can say everything to. And when he walked her home that night, he stood with her at the foot of the stairs that led to her room above the general store and looked at her in the dark street and said, "I think I love you, Ella." "I think I love you too, John," she said. He kissed her then, carefully and then less carefully, and the town of Caldwell went on around them in its noisy, ordinary way, the distant sounds from the saloon and the wind moving through the storefronts and a dog barking somewhere down the street, and none of it touched them at all. August gave way to September and the first coolness began to come into the mornings, and the light turned from gold to something thinner and more precise. The cattle drives had mostly ended for the season and Caldwell grew quieter, the trail hands gone south and east, the town settling into its truer self, the self that existed between the seasonal chaos of the drives. It was in September that Ella began to understand something she had been feeling at the edges of her awareness for weeks, which was that this town and this life and this man were not temporary things for her. She had come to Caldwell believing she would stay a year, two perhaps, teach her classes and save her wages and decide what came next. But what came next had arrived before she finished planning for it. And what came next was a green-eyed future that looked remarkably like a small house on the north end of Caldwell, and a man who carried her mother's Bible out of the dirt of Main Street, and a classroom of 22 children who needed her in a way that made her feel genuinely necessary. She wrote to her father in Missouri. She told him about Caldwell and the schoolhouse and the children. She told him about John Vaughn. She wrote carefully and honestly, the way she did everything, and she said that she had found something here worth staying for. Her father wrote back in October, a letter that took 3 weeks to arrive and that she read sitting on the edge of her bed with the evening light coming through the window. He said that he was glad. He said that the sound of her words was different from her previous letters, fuller somehow, less careful. He said he wished her mother could have known. He said he was doing better, that a neighbor had helped him replant, and that the new season looked more promising. He signed it the way he always did, with his full name, William James Rhodes, because he had always believed that a man should sign his name completely. She pressed the letter next to the children's drawings in the pages of her Shakespeare. John proposed to her on a Saturday morning in November. He had not made a production of it. He was not, as she had come to understand deeply by now, a man given to productions. He came to the general store while she was buying flour and soap and stood beside her at the counter until the shopkeeper moved away, and then he turned to her and said, "I want to marry you, Ella. I want to build a house and I want you to fill it with books and I want to wake up every morning next to someone who knows the names of the stars." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She stared at him for a full 3 seconds with the bag of flour in her arms. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding for some time. "Good," he said. "That's good. That's all that's good." "I've been practicing something more elaborate for 2 weeks," he admitted, "and I couldn't remember any of it just now." She laughed so suddenly and completely that the shopkeeper came back from the storeroom to see what the commotion was. They were married the following March, on the first Saturday after the spring mud dried enough to make church attendance practical. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Coles, who had a fine trembling voice that became less trembling as the service went on. Mrs. Hartley was in the front pew and cried without apparent embarrassment. Marshal Greer stood in the back and did not cry but removed his hat and held it over his heart the entire time. The schoolchildren had made a banner that said "God bless Miss Rhodes" and Deputy Vaughn in uneven letters that had been repainted twice after spelling errors, and it hung over the church door in a way that made Ella's eyes fill even as she laughed. Her father had come from Missouri. He had taken the train to Wichita and the stagecoach from there, arriving 2 days before the wedding with a face that was older and thinner than she remembered, but with eyes that were exactly the same. And when she embraced him on the street in front of the hotel, she felt him hold her with the tight, fierce grip of a man who has been afraid of losing something and has arrived to find it intact. He met John the next morning, and the two of them went for a walk together and came back an hour and a half later in what appeared to be a state of mutual respect and satisfaction. Her father shook John's hand on the steps of the hotel and said something low that she could not hear, and John nodded gravely, and after that the matter seemed settled in whatever private language men used to settle such matters. At the wedding, John stood at the altar looking at her as she came down the aisle with her father's hand on hers, and his face had that expression she had been collecting since the very beginning, the one that was patient and present and quietly attentive. And there was something in it today that was new, an openness that she had not quite seen before, as if the careful internal walls he had built over years of living carefully were not down exactly but had been unlocked, and the doors stood wide. She reached him, and her father put her hand in his and stepped back, and John held her hand the way he had held it that afternoon at the creek bank, simple and unhurried, as if he had always been about to do this. "I do," she said when it was time. "I do," he said, and his voice was steady and low and entirely sure. After the wedding there was a reception in the hotel dining room with its clean tablecloths, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a guitar, and there was dancing that spilled out onto the street. And Ella danced with her father and with Marshal Greer, who turned out to be a surprisingly capable dancer. And then she danced with John for a long time in the lamplight, and he was not a graceful dancer. He was too deliberate for grace. But he held her close and moved with her with that same steady attention he gave to everything, and she pressed her face into the warm fabric of his jacket and thought that this particular moment, was the answer to the question she had been carrying since she was a girl, lying on the roof of a Missouri farmhouse, trying to understand why some people were kind and some were not. John Vaughn had been born with kindness in him, the way some people are born with perfect pitch. It was not something he had practiced into existence. It was something fundamental in the structure of him. They moved into the house that John had been building since October with help from half the men in Caldwell, because in frontier towns people still built things together, not out of obligation, but because the alternative was watching your neighbor struggle with a hammer on a roof in November, and nobody wanted to be that kind of person. The house was small and solid, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft, and it sat on a 1/4 acre on the north end of town where Ella could see the rise of ground from her kitchen window. She hung her books on a shelf John had built along the entire east wall of the main room. She set her mother's Bible on the mantelpiece. She put her father's letter in the pages of her Shakespeare and put her Shakespeare on the shelf with the others. John brought Juniper home from the livery, where Marshal Greer had been keeping her. He had been training her all winter, and she was steady now, though she still startled at sudden sounds. And Ella, who had never had much to do with horses before coming west, began to visit her every evening with an apple or a piece of carrot. And Juniper would bend her great head down and breathe warm air into Ella's hair in a way that felt like being trusted. The spring of 1879 was gentle and full of new things. Ella's enrollment at the school had grown to 27 children, and she had written to the town council about adding an afternoon session for the older students. Mrs. Hartley had approved the idea with her characteristic brisk efficiency and said she would see about funding. John was given more responsibilities by Marshal Greer, who was beginning to speak about retirement in terms vague enough to mean it was at least 2 years away but specific enough to mean it was coming. One morning in April, Ella stood in the kitchen in the early light before John was awake and looked at the prairie through the window and understood, with a certainty that went beyond the physical evidence she was just beginning to accumulate, that they were going to have a child. She waited 3 more weeks to be sure, not because she doubted her own body, but because she wanted to be absolutely certain before she said it aloud, as if saying it made it real and being certain first was a protection of some kind. And then one Sunday morning after church, walking up the rise to their place on the high ground where they could see everything at once, she stopped and turned to John and said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her and she saw him understand before she said it, saw it move across his face like the light moving across the prairie when the clouds part. "Ella," he said. "We're going to have a baby," she said. He reached for her then, not the careful hand-holding of the creek bank but both arms, and she felt herself pulled against his chest and held there with the same fierce grip her father had used when he arrived in Caldwell, the grip of someone who has been afraid of losing something and has arrived to find it not only intact but expanding. "When?" he asked, his voice low against her hair. "October," she said. "November, perhaps." He held her for a long time on the high ground above the town, while the spring wind moved through the grass around them and Caldwell went about its Saturday morning business below, and when she finally drew back to look at him, his face was open in a way she had only seen it once before, at the altar in the church, all the careful locks undone. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said back. The summer of 1879 was hot and eventful. Ella continued teaching until August, when the growing evidence of the pregnancy made it impossible to pretend that nothing unusual was happening, and she handed her class over to a young woman named Miss Abernathy who had arrived in Caldwell in June, and who, under Ella's careful mentorship over 2 months, proved to be a genuinely gifted teacher. Ella promised the children she would come back in the spring, and held herself to that promise in her heart with the same determination she brought to everything. She was busy in those final months before the baby came. She sewed and mended and organized and baked, which she had not been particularly skilled at before but which she attacked with methodical interest until she improved, and she read everything she could find about what to expect, which was not much because the literature available in Caldwell on the subject was limited. She spoke with Mrs. Hartley, who had delivered 2 children of her own in the 1850s, and with the doctor, who was a young man named Dr. Webb who had come out from Philadelphia the previous year, and who was earnest and competent and deeply overwhelmed by everything the frontier threw at him on a regular basis. John was attentive to a degree that might have been suffocating from another man but was simply reassuring from him, because it was never anxious attention but steady attention, the same quality he brought to Juniper and to his work and to her. He checked in without hovering. He made things easier without taking things away from her. When she was tired, he made supper. When she wanted to talk, he listened. When she did not want to talk, he sat with her in the easy silence they had developed over 2 years of knowing each other. In October, with the leaves turning gold along the creek and the first frost coming at night, the baby came. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Ella was frightened in ways she had not expected. The basic animal fear of a body doing something enormous. But Dr. Webb was steady, and Mrs. Hartley was present, and John waited in the front room of the house with a patience that she could feel from the other side of the wall. And at last, in the cold gray light of an October morning, their son was born. He was small and loud and had dark hair exactly like his father's, and his eyes, when they opened, were the cloudy, uncertain color of every newborn's eyes, though over the following weeks they resolved themselves into something dark and bright that was unmistakably John's. "What do we name him?" John asked, holding the baby with the extreme careful concentration of a man who does not yet trust himself with something so small and so important. "William," Ella said. "For my father." John looked up at her. Something moved in his face that she recognized now as emotion that he was holding carefully, not suppressing but containing, the way you contain something precious. "William John Vaughn," he said, testing the shape of it. "Yes," she said. "That sounds exactly right." Her father received the telegram 3 days later. He wrote back within the week, a letter that took 10 days to arrive, and when Ella read it she cried properly for the first time since the night of the fire, tears that were not sad at all but that were the overflow of a container that had gotten too full. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the first winter Ella spent in Caldwell that felt entirely like home. They had a baby in the house, which changed everything and nothing. The house smelled differently and sounded differently, and time moved differently, organized now around feedings and sleeps, and the particular tyranny of a small person who had no idea he was ruling the household. But underneath all of it, the essential quality of the place was the same, warm and steady, and organized around the central fact of two people who had found each other in the dust of Main Street and decided to stay. John took to fatherhood the way she had known he would, the same deliberate attention he brought to horses, and to law enforcement and to love, applied now to this small human person who would grow up in the shadow of it without knowing for years how extraordinary it was. He sat with William in the evenings after supper and talked to him in the same low, unhurried voice he had used with Juniper in the livery, and Ella would sit nearby and listen and feel the peculiar luxury of being exactly where she was supposed to be. In the spring of 1880, Ella returned to the schoolhouse. Miss Abernathy had maintained things beautifully, and there was a brief period of adjustment while the children recalibrated to having both women present, but eventually the arrangement settled into something that worked well. Ella taught the mornings and Miss Abernathy the afternoons, and the older students got their second session, and the town council approved a small addition to the building, which would add a second room by the following fall. It was around this time that Marshal Greer made the announcement he had been circling for 2 years. He was retiring in June. He was 55 and his knees were bad, and he said, in the carefully measured speech he had prepared for the occasion, that he believed Caldwell needed someone younger in the office. He had already spoken to the town council. He was recommending John Vaughn for the position. There was a formal vote in May, conducted at the town hall meeting with the full participation of Caldwell citizens, men and women both contributing their voices to the discussion, if not formally to the ballot. And the result was exactly what it was always going to be, because there was not a person in Caldwell who had watched John Vaughn work for 3 years and arrived at any conclusion other than that he was the right man for the job. He came home that evening with the Marshal's badge in his hand, looking at it with an expression that was not pride exactly, but something more serious and more considered, something that understood the weight of what it represented. "How do you feel?" Ella asked. "Responsible," he said. She took the badge from his hand and pinned it to his shirt, and then she put both hands flat on his chest and looked up at him. "You already were," she said. He covered her hands with his and nodded, and the badge caught the lamplight and glinted between them like a small star. The summer of 1880 was a good one. John settled into his new role with the same quiet authority he had always carried, and Caldwell, which was slowly making its transition from cattle town to something more settled and civic-minded, found in him exactly the kind of marshal it needed for that transition. He was fair and he was firm, and he understood that the law was a thing in service of people, not people in service of the law, and that distinction made all the difference in how he worked. Ella expanded her school program that fall with the second room completed, and by October she had 36 children enrolled and was writing letters to the state education board about standards and funding with a persistence that Mrs. Hartley described as impressive, and the state board probably described less charitably. She did not care. The children of Caldwell deserved good schools, and Ella Rhodes Vaughn intended to see that they got them. William learned to walk in November of 1880 at 13 months, which Dr. Webb said was perfectly on schedule. He walked the way his father did, deliberate and balanced, though with considerably more falling down, and the house was suddenly a different kind of place, a place that required constant peripheral vision and the removal of anything fragile from any surface below knee height. Ella's father came for Christmas that year, his second visit to Caldwell, and stayed through January. He was better than he had been on his first visit, fuller in the face and more settled in his eyes, and he and John spent long evenings together by the fire talking about things that Ella was sometimes part of and sometimes observed from across the room with a quiet contentment she had no adequate words for. On Christmas morning, her father picked William up and held him and looked at his face for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "He looks like your mother." Ella looked at William, at his dark hair and his bright eyes and the particular sweetness of his round face. "He has John's hair," she said. "Yes," her father said, "but your mother's eyes." That look she had, like she was paying attention to everything and forgiving most of it. Ella put her arms around her father from behind, her chin on his shoulder, and looked at her son in his grandfather's arms. "Tell me about her," she said. "Tell me something I don't know." Her father was quiet for a moment. "She used to lie on the roof and look at the stars," he said. "She loved the sky. Drove me half mad in the beginning, her always wanting to be outside, always looking up. I was a practical man and she was a wonder." Ella closed her eyes for a moment against the back of his shoulder. "I know," she said. "I know exactly what you mean." In the new year of 1880, something happened that Ella had not anticipated, which was that Tommy Greer, who was now 13 and whose reading had improved dramatically over 3 years of patient work, wrote a story. He brought it to her one Monday morning, folded 4 times until it was the size of a playing card, and placed it on her desk without saying anything and went to sit down. She read it before school started, while the children were still filing in and hanging their coats on the pegs by the door. It was a story about a boy who could do arithmetic in his head faster than anyone, and who used this skill to save his father's ranch from being swindled. It was not a long story and it was not polished, but it was real, and the voice in it was utterly Tommy Greer's, specific and funny and full of detail. She read it twice. After school she kept Tommy back and told him what she thought, not with the careful vagueness of someone trying to be kind, but with the direct, specific praise of someone who meant every word. "This is a good story, Tommy," she said. "It's your story. Nobody else could have written it." He looked at the floor. "I'm still not a good reader," he said. "You're a better reader than you were a year ago," she said. "And you're a writer. Those are not always the same thing." She paused. "I want you to write more. Will you do that?" He looked up, surprised and pleased and uncertain in the way 13-year-olds are when they are caught caring about something. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She did not tell his father, the retired Marshal, until the following week, when she ran into him at the general store and he asked her how Tommy was doing in school. She told him about the story and watched the old man's face do something quietly extraordinary. "He never told me he was writing," he said. "He probably wasn't sure what to do with it," she said. "Some things take time to be sure about." Marshal Greer, retired now and therefore free to be a person, in ways the job had not always permitted, nodded at her with an expression that she recognized from many faces in Caldwell, the expression of someone who understood that Ella Vaughn was not merely a schoolteacher but something more specific and harder to name, someone who saw people for what they actually were and told them so. Spring came again, the 3rd spring of their marriage, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out their tender green leaves, and the grass grew back on the rise above the town, and William, who was now a year and a half old and deeply opinionated about everything, began saying words with great enthusiasm and questionable accuracy. One evening John came home from the Marshal's office and found Ella sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand and an expression he had not seen before. "What is it?" he asked. "It's from the State Education Board," she said. "They want to use the Caldwell school program as a model for new schools being established across the territory. They want me to come to Topeka in September to present our methods." He sat down across from her. "That's remarkable," he said. "I don't know if I should go," she said. "It would be a week, maybe 10 days. William and I will manage," he said. "You have a job," she said. "Deputy Carter can cover," he said. "Ella," he leaned forward and put his hand over hers. "This is important work. You have spent 3 years building something here that matters." Go and tell people how you did it so they can do it too." She looked at him across the table. This man, who had never once in 3 years of marriage suggested that her work was less important than his, who had understood from the beginning that she was a person with a purpose that belonged only to her, and that to diminish it would be to diminish the thing he loved most about her. "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure," he said. She went to Topeka in September of 1881 and presented for 3 days to a conference of education administrators and teachers and state officials, and she was nervous for approximately the first 10 minutes and confident for the rest of it, because she knew what she was talking about, and she had always been, at her core, someone who said what she knew directly and without apology. She came home to Caldwell on a Thursday evening on the stagecoach, and John was at the station with William in his arms, and William, seeing her, stretched both his arms out toward her with an expression of such total relief and joy that she cried right there on the street in front of everyone, crying properly the way she was learning to do more often now that the container was always full and always overflowing. John put his free arm around her and held both of them and said nothing, because nothing was required. The autumn of 1881 moved through its golden weeks, and the town of Caldwell held its 3rd annual Harvest Fair, which Ella had helped organize since the first year. There were games and food, and a pie contest that Mrs. Hartley won for the 2nd consecutive year with her elderberry pie, and there was a small talent show in which Tommy Greer, now 14, read one of his stories aloud to an audience of approximately 60 people, with a self-possession that made Ella's heart expand in her chest. She was standing next to John at the back of the crowd when Tommy read, and John's hand found hers without either of them looking, and they stood that way through the whole of it, fingers interlaced, listening to a 14-year-old boy read a story about a boy who could count stars faster than anyone and used this skill to navigate home through a winter blizzard. After the applause, she looked at John, and he was looking at her, and they shared the particular look of people who understand each other so completely that the conversation happens without words. In November, Ella discovered she was pregnant again. She told John on a Sunday morning, the same day of the week it had always been for their important conversations, standing on the rise above the town with the November wind cutting across the grass and William bundled against her hip in a carrier she had sewn the previous winter. "Again," John said, and then immediately, "I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say," she laughed. "I know it isn't. I meant, are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling wonderful," she said. "A little tired, but wonderful." He put his arm around her and pulled her and William both against his side and looked out over the town below, his town, the town he had made his responsibility, and she could feel the particular quality of his happiness, which was not the happiness of someone who has gotten what they wanted, but of someone who has recognized what they have. "Another baby," he said. "Another baby," she agreed. "William's going to have opinions about this," John said. "William has opinions about everything," she said. "He comes by it honestly." John looked down at her. "I'm not going to ask which one of us you mean by that," he said. "Wise," she said. The second baby was born in July of 1882, a girl this time, with Ella's dark hair and something in her face that was neither Ella nor John, but was entirely herself. A new person arrived in the world on a blazing July afternoon, with a cry that suggested she intended to be heard. They named her Clara, for John's sister in Tennessee, and John wrote to his sister the same day with a letter that Ella helped him draft, and that she suspected contained more feeling than he had put into any document since his deputy's oath. Clara Vaughn was a different kind of creature from her brother. Where William was deliberate and observant, Clara was immediate and loud and present in the way of a person who has decided that the world is interesting, and she intends to engage with all of it at once. She laughed easily and cried easily and wanted to be held, and then set down and then held again. And by the time she was 8 months old, she had achieved a complete strategic mastery of every adult in the house. William, who had been skeptical during the first weeks of his sister's existence, arrived at a settled acceptance of her around month 4, and by month 6 had become, in his serious 13-months-older way, her most loyal guardian. He would bring her things he thought she might want, toys and interesting sticks, and once a confused grasshopper that Ella had to retrieve before Clara decided to eat it. He would sit next to her and talk to her in low, confidential tones that Ella was almost certain were a conscious imitation of his father, though she did not say so. John's sister Clara, for whom the baby was named, came to visit in the fall of 1882. She was 26, a soft-spoken woman with John's dark eyes and a quality of stillness that was quieter than his but clearly from the same source. She stayed for 3 weeks, and she and Ella became friends with a speed that surprised them both, because they had enough in common and enough that was different to make the friendship both comfortable and interesting. One evening while John was on his rounds and the babies were asleep, the two women sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea and talked for hours about Tennessee and Missouri and Caldwell, and the particular experience of being a woman in a time and place that was still deciding how much room it had for women who thought and acted and built things of their own. "He's different since you," Clara said, meaning John. "He was always good. But before you he was careful in a way that made him a little separate from everything, like he was managing his life from a slight distance." She looked into her cup. "He's not separate now." "No," Ella said, "he's not." "What did you do?" Clara asked. Ella considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I didn't do anything particular," she said finally. "I just let him be seen. I think he'd been careful for so long that he'd forgotten someone could see him completely and still stay." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous thing to do for a person," she said. "It wasn't generous," Ella said. "I wanted to see him. I was curious about him from the first day. He's the most interesting person I've ever met." Clara smiled, and in the smile Ella saw John's face, the rare open version of it. "He says the same about you," Clara said. "Exactly that, the most interesting person." The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the coldest winter Caldwell had seen since John arrived. The kind of cold that came down from the north and sat over the plains like a lid. And the town hunkered down in it the way frontier towns did. Firewood stacked high and children kept inside, and the marshal's rounds conducted in twice the number of clothes anyone would normally wear. John came home one evening in January with snow in his hat and a look of suppressed amusement that Ella recognized as the face he made when something ridiculous had happened at the office. "What is it?" she asked. "Hector Lyle's cows got into the church again," he said. "All 8 of them." She pressed her lips together. "Again? 3rd time this winter. Reverend Coles is beside himself." John set his hat on the hook by the door and began unwrapping himself from his layers. "I spent 45 minutes convincing 8 cows that they wanted to leave a church." "How did you manage it?" "Same way I manage everything," he said, calmly and with great patience. She laughed, and he looked at her with that expression, the warm, buried amusement, and she thought for what might have been the 1000th time that she would never stop finding new things to love about John Vaughn. In the spring of 1883, the State Education Board formally adopted the Caldwell model for all new school establishments in the territory, and Ella received a letter of commendation signed by the governor of Kansas that Mrs. Hartley framed and hung in the schoolhouse without asking permission, which Ella pretended to object to and secretly loved. Tommy Greer, who was now 16, had been published. A story of his had appeared in a newspaper in Wichita after his father had sent it in on Tommy's behalf, the kind of parental initiative that Tommy claimed to be mortified by and that everyone, including Tommy, knew he was secretly proud of. Ella had the newspaper folded and pressed into her Shakespeare. She had a lot of things pressed into her Shakespeare by now. It was getting thick with years. That summer brought John's sister back for a second visit, and this time she brought a man with her, a schoolteacher from Nashville named Edward Price, who was quiet and kind, and looked at Clara with the helpless attentiveness of a man in the early stages of something he doesn't yet know how to manage. Ella watched them across the supper table and caught John's eye and said nothing. John's mouth moved in what was almost a smile. After supper, when Edward and Clara had gone for a walk and the children were in bed, Ella and John sat on the porch in the warm summer evening and listened to the sounds of Caldwell settling toward night, the distant music from somewhere down the street and the horses in the livery and the wind moving through the new leaves of the cottonwood John had planted in the yard the previous spring. "She's happy," John said. "She is," Ella agreed. "He seems like a good man." "He is," she said. "You can tell. It's in how he listens." John was quiet for a moment. "Is that how you knew?" he asked. "About me?" She considered this honestly. "That was part of it," she said. "Listen like what I said actually mattered, like you were actually interested in what I thought." She paused. "And you picked up my mother's Bible from the dirt without being asked." He turned to look at her. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about that first day," she said. "I remember the way you held it spine up so the pages wouldn't fall, like you knew what it was." He was quiet. "Did you?" she asked. "Did you know what it was?" "I could see it mattered to you," he said. "That was enough." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat that way in the warm dark, listening to the summer night, and Caldwell moved around them in its ordinary, extraordinary way, and the children slept inside the house they had built together, and the cottonwood John had planted was already taller than she'd expected, green and reaching upward in the Kansas dark. The years moved the way years do when they are full, quickly in retrospect and richly in the living of them. The town of Caldwell continued its gradual transformation from cattle town to settled community, though it never lost entirely the quality of the frontier, that sense of something still being worked out, still being decided. John served as Marshal with the same quiet authority he had always had, and the town was safer for it and knew it. Ella's school grew and changed, adding teachers and rooms and finally a second building, and children who learned in it grew up and left and sometimes came back and always remembered. Ruth Haskell, who had measured Ella with her serious gaze across the classroom at 12, went east to a women's college in Ohio at 18. She wrote letters back to Ella that were brilliant and funny and full of ideas, and Ella wrote back with equal enthusiasm, and the correspondence continued for years, Ruth eventually becoming a teacher herself and then a writer of educational texts. Tommy Greer published 3 more stories in Kansas papers and then 2 in a New York paper, and then, at 20, he left Caldwell for the East with $200 saved and the complete and obvious blessing of everyone in town. He wrote to Ella twice a year, regular as seasons, and the letters were always wonderful. Clara Vaughn married Edward Price in Tennessee in the spring of 1884, and Ella and John attended the wedding with William, now 4½, in a tiny suit that he regarded with great seriousness and considerable personal dignity. Clara looked at her new husband the way Ella had once thought only she looked at John, with that particular quality of attention that meant a person had found their center of gravity. On the train home from Tennessee, William fell asleep against John's arm and John sat in the rattling car looking out at the darkening countryside, and Ella watched him from across the narrow aisle, this man she had been watching for 6 years now, and found that she was still finding new things in him, still arriving at new understanding of who he was the way you arrive, after years of walking a landscape, at a view you had not known was there. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked at her. "About the first time I saw you," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "What about it?" "Your trunk broke and your things went everywhere," he said. "And you didn't look scared or embarrassed. You just looked determined, like you had decided the situation was going to be solved and were already working on solving it." He paused. "I thought whoever that woman is, she knows what she's made of." "I had no idea what I was made of," she said. "I was terrified." "That's exactly what I mean," he said. "You were terrified and you looked determined. That's a particular kind of person." The train moved through the dark. William breathed steadily against John's arm. "What would you have done," she asked, "if I'd said no, when you asked to walk with me on Sundays?" He thought about it seriously, which was always what he did. Kept finding reasons to be nearby, he said, until you changed your mind. You would have been patient enough for that. For you, he said, yes. She leaned across the aisle and kissed him briefly, and he smiled, that rare, complete smile, and the train carried them west toward Kansas and home. Baby Clara was 4 now and full of fire and opinions, and had recently decided that she wanted to learn to ride Juniper, who was 7 years old and very gentle, and had approximately as much patience as John, which was to say an extraordinary amount. The riding lessons became a Sunday morning ritual that Ella watched from the fence with William beside her, both of them observing with the particular combination of pride and held breath that parents develop when their children are doing something both wonderful and slightly terrifying. John would lead Juniper around the yard with Clara sitting very straight in the saddle, her little face set with concentration, and would talk to her in the same low, unhurried voice he had always used with frightened horses and frightened people. And Juniper would move steadily, and Clara would slowly relax her grip and begin to feel the animal's rhythm. And Ella would watch and think about the years between watching him in the livery doorway and this moment, all the things that had happened in between, all the living that had been accumulated. In the autumn of 1884, Ella discovered she was pregnant a 3rd time. She told John on the rise above the town, as had become their tradition, in the October afternoon with the light going golden over the grass and the town below them small and dear and complete. "Are you well?" he asked first, exactly as he had asked the 2nd time. "I'm wonderful," she said. He pulled her against his side, and they stood looking at the town together, at the church and the schoolhouse with its 2 buildings now, and the marshal's office and the hotel and the general store, and all the ordinary structures of a life they had built together in this place. "3 children," he said. "3," she agreed. "Caldwell is going to run out of children for you to teach," he said. "Caldwell will never run out of children," she said. "And besides, I'm not just teaching anymore. I'm building a system." He looked down at her, something luminous in his expression. "Yes, you are," he said. The 3rd baby was born in June of 1885, another boy, with Ella's coloring and John's jaw and a disposition that revealed itself over the first weeks to be a combination of both of them, curious and patient simultaneously, interested in everything and willing to wait to understand it. They named him Thomas, for no particular reason other than that it suited him from the first, and Tommy Greer, hearing of it by letter in New York, wrote back immediately with a response that made Ella laugh out loud at the kitchen table and made John raise his eyebrows and ask what was funny. "Tommy says he's honored and also suspicious that we didn't warn him in advance," she said. "It wasn't named for him," John said. "He knows that," she said. "He's flattered anyway." The summer of 1885 was full and bright, and Caldwell was a good place to be. A town that had made its choices about what it wanted to be and was becoming it, slowly, and with the particular dignity of a place that had been through enough to appreciate stability. John was respected and effective as Marshal, known throughout the county as a man who could be relied on absolutely, and who had never once in 7 years of law enforcement in Caldwell mistaken his authority for permission to be unkind. Ella's school was, by any measure, the best in the territory. She had 3 teachers working under her now, and a curriculum that had been written up in 2 education journals, one in Kansas and one in Ohio, and she still taught the youngest children herself every morning because she found it necessary. The particular pleasure of watching a child arrive at reading or at understanding for the first time, that moment of illumination on a small face that she had never gotten tired of and suspected she never would. William was 5 and starting at the school, which presented a certain interesting challenge. Ella was careful to be his teacher in the same way she was everyone else's, which William seemed to understand with his characteristic seriousness, and cooperated with accordingly, though she occasionally caught him watching her with an expression that was purely his father's, patient and attentive and privately amused. Clara was 4 and would start school the following year, and she spent the weeks of William's first school days in a state of deep indignation about the unfairness of being excluded. Thomas was an infant and was largely unaware of the social politics of the household. One September evening, with all three children finally asleep, and the house in the particular quiet that descends when small people have stopped moving, Ella sat at her desk in the main room working on the following week's lessons, and John came in from his last rounds and sat down in the chair across from her and looked at her with an expression she recognized but could not immediately place. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her pen. "Nothing bad," he said. "Then what?" He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. "Letter came today," he said, "from the state governor's office." She waited. "They're establishing a new position," he said. "State-level law enforcement supervisor. 3 counties including this one. They want someone with experience and a known record." He paused. "They want me." She looked at him. "It would mean more travel," he said. 3-4 days a month away, more responsibility, more pay." He put the letter on the desk. "I didn't say yes or no. I wanted to talk to you first." She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through the way she thought everything through, all the way to the edges. "Is this what you want?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I asked first," she said. He looked at the letter on the desk. "I think," he said slowly, "that what I have in Caldwell is worth more than any position. I think this house and these children and this life are the thing I would be foolish to risk." He paused. "But I also think that the work matters, that there are people in those other counties who deserve what Caldwell has, and if I can bring that to them, then that's worth something." "Then say yes," she said. He looked up. "Say yes," she said again. "The children and I will be here when you come home. The 3 or 4 days a month will be hard and we'll manage them. The work matters, you just said so." She paused. "You did not marry someone who would ask you to be smaller than you are, John Vaughn." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression, the one that had been becoming more and more itself over the years, all the locks undone and everything visible. "I know that," he said. "I know exactly who I married." He sent his acceptance the next day. The autumn moved into the early quiet of the beginning of their 8th year in Caldwell, their 7th year of marriage, and the life they had built continued its particular shape, full and warm and occasionally chaotic and fundamentally, essentially good. On a Sunday morning in October, the last warm Sunday before the real cold came, Ella and John walked up to the rise above the town the way they had always done, though this time they had 3 children with them. William walking with his father's deliberate step, Clara running ahead and back and ahead again like a kite in uncertain wind, and Thomas carried in John's arms looking at the sky with the wide-eyed concentration of a person still learning the names of things. They stood on the high ground and looked out over Caldwell below, over the church and the school with its 2 buildings and the marshal's office and the hotel and the general store and the cottonwood along the creek that were turning gold in the October light, and above it all the enormous Kansas sky, blue and deep and endless in every direction. "What's that one?" William asked, pointing at the single bright star visible in the afternoon sky, low on the western horizon. "That's Venus," Ella said. "It's a planet, but it looks like a star." "Why does it look like a star?" he asked. "Because it's very bright and very far away," she said. "When things are that far away, you can't always tell exactly what they are, but if you watch it over time, you'll see it moves differently from the stars around it." William considered this with his father's seriousness. "I'll watch it," he said. John looked at Ella over the top of William's head, and she looked back at him. And in that look was everything. 7 years and 3 children and a broken trunk and a mother's Bible, and a frightened bay mare, and a rise of ground above a cattle town in Kansas, and all the mornings and all the evenings, and all the Sunday afternoons, and all the words and all the silences, and all the things that had grown between 2 people who had found each other in the dust of Main Street and decided. Without knowing exactly what they were deciding, to stay, Clara came running back from wherever she had gone and grabbed Ella's hand. "Mama, there's a hawk," she said. "Come and see." "Show me," Ella said. And Clara pulled her forward, running, toward whatever was next. John followed with Thomas in his arms and William at his side, unhurried and steady, the way he had always been, the way she had always known he was, the man who picked things up from the dirt without being asked and carried them carefully and gave them back without making it mean more than it meant, except that it meant everything. It had always meant everything from the very first day. The hawk was circling high above the grass, riding a thermal with its wings spread wide, barely moving, suspended between the earth and the sky in the way that beautiful things sometimes are, in the exact place where the ordinary world becomes extraordinary if you are paying attention. They stood together on the high ground, the five of them, and watched it circle. The town of Caldwell went on below them, as towns do, full of its ordinary life, its shops and its church and its school and its arguments and its celebrations. And the wind moved through the grass around them, and the light lay golden over the prairie in every direction. And somewhere behind them, the sun was beginning its long slide toward the west. And John Vaughn had his arm around Ella Rhodes Vaughn, and their daughter was pointing at a hawk, and their sons were watching the sky. And the future stretched out ahead of them wide and warm and entirely open, not unwritten but still being written, the way all the best things are, word by word and day by day, for as long as the people in it choose to keep saying yes to it. She leaned into his side. He held her closer. Nothing needed to be said. The hawk made one more wide circle above them and then banked into the wind and flew south, growing smaller and smaller against the blue until it was gone, until it was something you had to take on faith had ever been there at all, except that they had all four seen it, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole of it. They walked home together as the sun went down.